Hi everyone, it's Dr. Joni Johnston. Welcome to another featured crime analysis. I want to give you a heads up about this case because it really is particularly tragic and grim. But I'm covering this because it really is going to serve as a launching pad for me to talk about some psychology topics that I think are really important to be aware of as parents, as adults, as mental health professionals. And it also, I think, highlights some of the misunderstandings out there about some of these topics. So this case involves 36-year-old Lisa Snyder, who was a single mom. And on September the 23rd, 2019, she called 911 and said that she had just discovered her 8-year-old son, Connor, and her 4-year-old daughter, Brinley, hanging from the rafters in the basement. Now, when emergency personnel got there, the kids were still hanging. And Lisa said that she tried to get Brinley, the 4-year-old, down, but that she weighed about 40 pounds. And Lisa said that when she gets anxious, she gets super sweaty and that she couldn't get a grip on her daughter. Connor, who was 8 years old, weighed about 150, and she said he was just too heavy for her. So emergency personnel got them down, and even though they were unresponsive initially, they were able to revive them and rush them both to the hospital. Now, Lisa said that earlier that day, they had gotten home from school, and Connor had asked Brinley if she wanted to go build a fort in the basement. I guess building forts was kind of Connor's thing. And Lisa said that they often would go down to the basement and play. And she, in fact, recalled hearing Connor kind of drag the chairs down to the basement to put blankets and stuff on. And that she, at one point, went outside to smoke a cigarette, and she began throwing the dog toy to the dogs, kind of lost track of time, estimated that she was gone about 10 minutes, and then came in and found them. She also said that Connor had been very depressed because he was being bullied at school, and that he had on several occasions in recent weeks told her he wanted to die, he wanted to kill himself, but he was afraid to go by himself. And so her theory was that Connor had somehow convinced Brinley, made Brinley get up on the chair. There were 2 chairs that were turned over on their sides in the basement, had somehow essentially murdered Brinley and then taken his own life. Investigators were incredibly concerned about the story because, first of all, it's very unusual to have the deaths of 2 young children from the same family in this way. And also, as one district attorney later said, there was this belief that 8-year-olds don't commit suicide. So I thought that was interesting because, as it turns out, 8-year-olds do commit suicide. And I think for many, many years, parents and mental health professionals alike have really not paid a lot of attention to this. It is pretty rare. So in any given year, about 33 children between the age of 5 and 11 will commit suicide. And for some, maybe because it is so rare, there hasn't been a lot in the research on it. It's almost like we tended to kind of think suicide starts with puberty. So we don't know a lot about that, but it does happen. As a matter of fact, in 2017, there was another case of an 8-year-old little boy who was bullied horribly at school, and on one occasion was dragged into the bathroom and physically assaulted by his peers. And 2 days later, he hung himself with a necktie off of his bunk bed. So even though it's rare, it does happen. Now, then the question becomes, well, who would do this? What kind of child, what would be wrong with a child who would do this? And do they really realize what they're doing? That's kind of interesting. So we know, for example, that certain diagnoses tend to go along with suicide, just like they do in adults. So obviously kids who are depressed are more likely to attempt suicide. But we also find out that kids who have ADHD, who have oppositional defiant disorder, who have learning problems, who have social difficulties are also more likely to attempt suicide. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's not so much the diagnoses that separates children from adults when we look at suicide, it's the situation. So what we find is that children this age, 5 to 11, who attempt suicide or commit suicide are much more likely to be influenced by the situation and to do it more impulsively. So what can happen is you have a child who is experiencing some difficulty, severe family discord, severe bullying at school. They get incredibly distressed by a certain event and they impulsively take their own life. So they don't think it through. And so does that mean that that child isn't really aware of what they're doing? Well, I think yes and no. I think whenever we're being impulsive, no matter what age you are, we don't often think through right then the consequences of what can happen. And I think children probably are more likely to do that. At the same time, that does not mean that children don't understand suicide and what the implications are. So what we know is that by third grade, the vast majority of children know what suicide is, and they are in fact able to tell an adult at least one way that somebody could do it. We also know that children starting around age 6, but definitely by age 8 or 9, are very clear that when you die, you don't come back. So it's not like this is a child who's 8 years old who thinks somehow I'm going to escape this pain and then come back next week. This child is aware that death is final. So I think the implications for us as adults, as parents, as teachers, as mental health professionals is that if a child in this age range talks about suicide or says, I want to kill myself, or I'm so miserable, I want to die, we need to take that seriously. Now, I've heard some people say, well, that's just an attention getting thing. I have a child who's done this and they just, whenever they're mad and they're not getting their way, this child will say, I'm going to kill myself if you don't do this. My response to that is this. If a child needs to threaten or feels that threatening suicide is a way to get what they want, that in and of itself is a severe problem. And so a child who's talking about suicide, no matter what the motive is, I believe needs to be seen by a mental health professional. So we do know that children as young as 8 can commit suicide. Now, according to Lisa, this, however, is a murder-suicide. And I don't find any evidence for that. Children do die, unfortunately, by murder-suicide. I think 42 children died by murder-suicide in 2017, but they are victims. And most often, the perpetrator is a parent. It can be an estranged parent who's in the middle of a custody battle. It could be a divorce situation. It could be, I'm going to pay you back by killing the kids. But children are victims of murder-suicide. I have never heard of a child who has murdered another child and then taken his or her life. I actually did some research on this when I was reading about this case to see if I could find an example of another child who had done this. And the earliest age I found of murder-suicide was 14. And this was a 14-year-old boy who was in a relationship. There was conflict and a breakup, and he killed his girlfriend and then himself. And that's consistent with 65% of murder-suicides in which the perpetrator is in a love relationship or some kind of romantic relationship with the victim, kills the victim, and then kills himself. So it is extremely unlikely that a child who's 8 years old would kill his sister and then kill himself. So what does this tell us? Well, let's talk about parents who commit suicide, or mothers who kill their children. And that gets a little more complicated. So moms who kill their children tend to fall into a couple of different categories. First of all, moms who kill newborns, what we call neonaticide, tend to be young mothers, isolated mothers who don't have a lot of support, sometimes impoverished mothers. And these are often teenagers or women in their very early 20s who essentially have almost denied they're pregnant this entire pregnancy. They don't want this baby. They don't know what to do with this baby. And so they kind of get in this like, almost like if I don't acknowledge it, then it doesn't exist. And then, so they will hide their pregnancy. They won't get any kind of prenatal care. And then once the child is born, they get rid of it. Then you look at, there's kind of another age group, and that's mothers who kill children from age, after 24 hours to age 1. So that's what we call infanticide. mothers who commit infanticide tend to fall into one of two categories. One is a mother who is experiencing either postpartum psychosis, so becomes delusional about this child and ends up killing this child, oftentimes in a distorted kind of altruistic kind of way, or a psychotic depression, which can kind of be the same thing. Or it's the really sad scenario where you have this mom who basically says this kid wouldn't shut up. In other words, this is a mom who is overwhelmed. She's not, can't handle this child. And there, it's either an extension of abuse that this, baby is already experiencing, or the mom gets so frustrated that the intent is not to kill the child, it's to make the child be quiet, or it's to punish the child or do something like that, and the child dies as a result of this abuse. When you're talking about children over the age of 1, dads are twice as likely to kill older children than mothers are. And when we look at mothers who've killed children, there are different motives that we can kind of tease out depending upon the situation. So we still have mothers sometimes who are experiencing some kind of psychosis and develop a delusion around their child, or they develop this belief that the child can't survive without them, and so they're going to take this child with them, or spare this child from some problem. We have parents, or we have mothers who, again, accidentally kill a child. They're abusing this child. This child has been physically abused. And so the death is an accident, but is an extension of this ongoing physical abuse. We have mothers who kill older children because they don't want them. In other words, this child is in my way. I want to have a relationship with this man. He doesn't want children. I don't like these kids anymore. There's all kinds of reasons. So it's the unwanted child. And then we have, which is very rare, the mother who kills children out of revenge. In other words, I'm going to kill your kids because I'm so angry at you. And that is very, very rare. Now, let's look at Lisa. So, first of all, this case has not gone to trial. And so the evidence hopefully will speak for itself. Lisa is legally innocent until proven guilty. There are some things, though, at least when we look at the probable cause affidavit, which I'll put a link to, that are very concerning about this case. Number one, there's a history of Child Protective Service involvement in this case. Now, it goes back to 2014, 2015. So, and we don't know, the records are sealed. We don't know what that involvement entailed, why it happened, why the kids were removed from the home in 2014 and were given back to Lisa in 2015. That remains to be seen. But there is a history of Child Protective Service involvement. We also know, at least according to one witness, that Lisa was depressed. She had told a friend of hers a couple of weeks before this happened that she was incredibly depressed, that she was having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, and that she no longer cared for her kids. So those are two things that are obviously concerning. And there are also some things just from an evidence standpoint that look very challenging for her. So for example, the rope that the children were hanging from turned out to be a dog leash. And this dog leash was for a dog that was up to 250 pounds. Now, they did have a dog at their house that she gave away after all this happened that weighed about 50 pounds. But this was a leash that was for a dog that weighed up to 250 pounds that she had purchased the day before this happened. So that clearly is of concern. Also, their investigators have talked to friends of Connor's, teachers of Connor's, other family members, family friends, and nobody said there was any evidence that Connor was being bullied. He seemed to be somebody who had friends. He seemed happy at school. So the only person who has ever said that Connor was suicidal or depressed is Lisa. Also, when they confiscated all the electronic devices in the house, they found some very, very incriminating searches on her cell phone. So a couple days before this happened, she had done some Googling of I almost got away with it, carbon monoxide, how long does it take to die? And she had visited at least one website that essentially showed how to hang yourself, I guess, or somebody else with what they call a drop suspension, meaning from a short distance. So when you take all this together, I think that it'll be interesting to see kind of how this case plays itself out. But I think the bottom line is that the evidence will speak for itself, and that children as young as 8 can and do commit suicide. But that does not mean, in this case, that Connor did.